You know, one of the most dangerous assumptions we make, often unconsciously, is that people around us have our best interests at heart. We assume that when we share a personal story, a struggle, a hope, or even a victory, the person listening will treat that information with care. We believe they will hold it gently, perhaps offer empathy, maybe even encouragement. But this belief, however comforting, is frequently wrong, and dangerously so. The reality is that not everyone in your life is a friend, even if they smile like one. Not everyone who listens to you is doing so out of compassion or loyalty. In fact, many listen for very different reasons: to gossip, to compare, to judge, or even to weaponize what you've said later on. This isn't paranoia, it's pattern recognition. Carl Jung, the great psychoanalyst, talked about the shadow, the dark unconscious part of the psyche that we all carry. The shadow contains everything we don't want to admit about ourselves: jealousy, resentment, pride, cruelty. And make no mistake, it's not just your shadow you need to be aware of. It's everyone else's too. Because when you share personal details, especially the ones that matter, you're handing over a piece of your inner life. And unless the person receiving it has integrated their own shadow, has developed a level of maturity and moral clarity, what you give them can easily become a tool of projection. Your vulnerability becomes their playground for ego judgment, or worse, betrayal. There's a psychological phenomenon called schadenfreude, pleasure derived from another's misfortune. It's real, and it's far more common than we'd like to admit. People may not always celebrate your progress. In fact, sometimes they feel diminished by it. Your success reminds them of their stagnation. Courage reminds them of their fear. And your openness, ironically, can expose you to their unconscious desire to see you stumble. They may not even be aware of it themselves. That's what makes it so insidious. It's not calculated evil, it's silent resentment. Let's say, for example, you tell someone about a major life decision you're struggling with, a job change, a breakup, a dream you're chasing. Maybe you're trying to sort through the chaos and just need to verbalize it. But the moment you expose that uncertainty, that delicate state of becoming, you're also exposing yourself to external judgments that can disrupt your inner compass. Advice comes cloaked as concern, but it's often laced with projection. Are you sure that's a good idea? I heard someone else tried that and failed. You're really going to leave something stable for that? Now, those words may seem harmless on the surface, but they plant seeds of doubt, seeds that didn't exist until you let someone into your private, vulnerable space. It's not about demonizing people. Most people are not malicious, but they are unaware. And unawareness, when mixed with proximity to your private life, is a volatile combination. Because unawareness cannot hold space for your complexity. It simplifies you into a character in their story. You become the dreamer, the fool, the reckless one, the threat. And now you're no longer navigating your life, you're defending it. There's a reason ancient wisdom traditions, from Stoicism to Buddhism, emphasize restraint in speech. They understood the moral weight of words, how speech can either liberate or entangle us. Every time you speak about your personal life, you're not just communicating, you're constructing a shared narrative. And once that narrative leaves your lips, you no longer own it. It becomes distorted through the lens of the listener's biases, their insecurities, their unresolved pain. Think about that. Think about how many versions of you exist in other people's minds, all based on what you've chosen to share and how they've chosen to interpret it. And now ask yourself, how many of those interpretations serve you? Often reminds us that responsibility begins with the individual. Part of that responsibility is knowing what to share, when to share it, and with whom. Because discretion isn't secrecy, it's sovereignty. It's the recognition that your inner world, the battles you fight, the dreams you hold, the wounds you carry, is sacred. And not everyone deserves a front row seat to it. So don't rush to tell your story just to feel heard. Make sure the listener has earned the privilege to hear it. Make sure they've shown themselves to be psychologically stable, emotionally intelligent, and morally grounded. Because your personal life is not just information, it's identity. And identity should be guarded with the same care you'd give to anything you value deeply. In a world that thrives on oversharing and quick validation, choosing silence, intentional, dignified silence, is a form of power. And power, when used wisely, protects peace. Remember this: what you share carelessly can be used carelessly. What you guard carefully becomes your strength. One of the most overlooked forms of strength in the modern world is restraint. We live in a time where we are constantly encouraged to share our experiences, our emotions, our thoughts, our relationships, publicly and frequently. We've bought into the idea that transparency is always virtuous, that visibility equals authenticity. But that assumption is flawed, because there is a kind of clarity, even sanity, that comes not from expressing everything, but from withholding wisely. Privacy, contrary to what we're being told, isn't isolation, it's protection, it's discipline, and above all, it's peace. When you guard your personal life, when you refrain from exposing every detail of your inner world to others, you create a buffer between yourself and the chaos of external judgment. That buffer is not a wall that disconnects you from others. It's more like a filter, one that allows only the necessary and the trustworthy to enter. Without it, you're constantly reacting to noise, to misinterpretations, to assumptions about your life that don't reflect the truth of your experience. Or people often confuse peace with comfort, but peace is far deeper than that. Peace is the absence of unnecessary conflict. And much of that conflict arises not from events themselves, but from how those events are perceived, retold, and mishandled by others. When you share personal details indiscriminately, you open the door to other people's perceptions. You invite their commentary, their biases, their emotional baggage to mix with your reality, and now you're no longer living your life. You're managing reactions to your life. This is where things get psychologically taxing, because your mind begins to track how others see you. You start editing yourself to avoid their criticism or earn their approval. Slowly, subtly, your internal compass becomes distorted. And once your identity starts bending to the expectations of others, you've lost something essential. You've lost the stillness that comes from living in alignment with your own values, not someone else's narrative. In philosophy, there's a concept from the Stoics, ataraxia, which means a state of imperturbable tranquility. It's not the absence of problems, it's the presence of inner steadiness, regardless of what's happening around you. You can't cultivate that kind of steadiness if you're constantly handing over pieces of yourself to people who don't know how to hold them. You'll be yanked around by opinion, distorted by gossip, and exhausted by the emotional fallout that comes from being too open too soon with too many. Now let me be clear. This doesn't mean you shut everyone out. It doesn't mean you walk through life guarded and suspicious, but it does mean you choose carefully. You become deliberate about who gets access to your inner world. And you recognize that the most peaceful people are not necessarily those with the least problems. They're often the ones who've simply decided not to share their problems with everyone. There's a psychological cost to being constantly observed. We know this from research in behavioral science. When people know they're being watched, they change how they behave. This is called the Hawthorne effect, and it applies just as much to our personal lives. The more you expose your private self to an audience, whether that audience is 2 people or 2,000, the more self-conscious you become. And self-consciousness is the enemy of authenticity. Instead of being, you start performing. Instead of reflecting, you start reacting. That shift over time erodes your sense of self. But when you preserve your privacy, when you give yourself the space to experience life without the pressure of commentary, you are able to process things more clearly. You can make decisions based on reason and intuition, not anxiety. You can feel deeply without feeling the need to explain yourself. And you can change quietly without needing permission. And that's another overlooked truth. Real transformation often happens in silence. It's not loud, it's not performative. It doesn't need applause. You grow, you heal, you evolve away from the spotlight. You do the work internally, and then one day the results speak for themselves. But that only happens if you've protected your process. If you've guarded your peace. In religious and spiritual traditions around the world, the idea of a sacred space is common. A temple, a sanctuary, a quiet place where the noise of the world is kept out. We need that psychologically too. Your personal life, your thoughts, your dreams, your fears must be treated as sacred. And sacred things are not meant to be thrown casually into the public sphere. They lose their power that way. They become ordinary. And once they're ordinary, they're vulnerable. When you keep your personal life private, you're not being deceptive. You're being wise. You're creating space for peace to exist. You're giving your mind a place to rest, your emotions a place to breathe, and your identity a chance to grow free from interference. So ask yourself, who knows what about you and why? Have they earned it? Have they demonstrated the maturity, the respect, the stillness to handle the weight of your truth? If not, what are you really gaining by sharing it with them, other than momentary relief, followed by prolonged vulnerability? You don't owe anyone your story. You owe yourself your peace. And here's the truth. The less you explain, the more power you retain. There's a psychological danger in the modern obsession with transparency. We've been taught, often by well-meaning voices, that vulnerability is always virtuous, that the more we open up, the more authentic we become. But what's often left out of that narrative is the cost of boundary erosion. Because the truth is, oversharing doesn't make us more connected. It often makes us more exposed. And exposure, when it's unfiltered and premature, weakens us. Not because truth is inherently weak, but because context and timing matter. Boundaries exist for a reason. Every individual needs a psychological perimeter, something like a border that defines where you end and where the outside world begins. This isn't just a metaphor, it's a deep structural necessity for the healthy functioning of the self. Without boundaries, there's no coherent identity. You're no longer acting from within a solid framework of values, responsibilities, and direction. You're reacting to everyone else's input. You're constantly accommodating, explaining, defending. And that makes you brittle, that makes you manipulable. Freud understood this in his own way. He spoke about the ego's task being not just to navigate internal impulses and external reality, but also to maintain cohesion under pressure. And pressure comes from many places. One of the greatest sources of psychological pressure in today's world comes from the collapse of personal boundaries, particularly the boundary between the private self and the social self. Now think about how easy it is today to dissolve that boundary. A conversation with someone you barely know turns into a therapy session. A social media post becomes a digital confessional. A passing moment of vulnerability gets broadcast as a declaration of identity. And then we wonder why we feel emotionally scattered, misunderstood, and overwhelmed. We've skipped the fundamental step of containment. We haven't given our own thoughts time to develop into clarity before offering them up for commentary. When you overshare, you're not being more real. You're diluting your interior life. You're giving away something essential before it's even fully formed. You're taking the raw, sacred material of your experience and placing it in the hands of people who may not know what to do with it, or worse, people who'll use it to define you in ways you didn't intend. That's not intimacy, that's exposure masquerading as connection. Let's be clear, there is a place for vulnerability. It is not a weakness, but it is not a casual act either. It's something that should be earned, not expected. Real vulnerability is a deliberate act within the safety of trust. It's not meant to be shared with everyone. When it is, it stops being powerful and starts being performative. And the moment you start performing your inner life rather than living it, you lose integrity. You begin to live out other people's expectations instead of your own truth. Oversharing also invites what I would call moral clutter. The more people you involve in your inner life, the more opinions, values, and unresolved projections you allow to invade your mind. Now, every choice you make becomes entangled in a web of other people's reactions. You hesitate. You second guess. You poll for approval before you move. That is not self-governance. That's emotional dependency, and it keeps you in a psychological holding pattern. Boundaries, on the other hand, protect your ability to think, to grow, and to act clearly. They provide the necessary separation to develop strength and clarity before you bring your decisions or experiences to anyone else. They allow you to live from the inside out, not from the outside in. And that's critical, because a life lived from the outside in is a life of performance. But a life lived from the inside out, that's where freedom lives. Now, there's another dimension here that we often overlook: power. When you have clear boundaries, when you know what parts of yourself are private and protected, you hold a kind of quiet power, not over others, but over your own life. You choose what to reveal, when to reveal it, and to whom. That discernment creates respect. People begin to see you as grounded, not easily influenced, not desperate to be seen or understood. That kind of self-possession is rare, and it's magnetic. There's a reason why the most compelling people often say very little about their personal lives. It's not because they have nothing to say. It's because they understand the value of containment. They've built an inner architecture strong enough to withstand loneliness, uncertainty, and complexity without always broadcasting it for validation. And when they do speak, people listen because their words haven't been diluted by overuse. If you want to build that kind of inner strength, start by examining your impulse to share. Ask yourself, why am I saying this? What do I hope to gain? And am I speaking from clarity or from confusion? Those questions will tell you a lot about your own boundaries and where they may need to be reinforced. Because ultimately, the strength of your life doesn't lie in how much you reveal. It lies in how well you protect what matters most. And never forget, when you respect your own boundaries, the world learns to respect you. There's a strange paradox in human relationships. We crave connection, yet we're constantly disappointed by people. We want to be understood, seen for who we are, and supported in our deepest struggles. But far too often, we open up to the wrong people at the wrong time, mistaking familiarity for loyalty, attention for care. And in doing so, we set ourselves up for disillusionment. One of the most painful lessons you can learn is that time is the ultimate test of character. Not words, not charm, not shared interests, time. Because it is only through time that consistency reveals itself, that integrity is proven, and that the truth of someone's heart becomes visible. And when it comes to sharing the vulnerable, sacred parts of your personal life, nothing less than that kind of earned trust will suffice. We tend to believe that trust is built quickly, that it's the result of a deep conversation, or a shared hardship, or even just a good vibe. But that belief is naive, it's emotionally impulsive, and it's dangerous. Real trust doesn't emerge out of intensity, it emerges out of reliability. You observe someone over months, even years. You watch how they respond when you fail, when you succeed, when you're absent, when you're vulnerable. And slowly, a pattern emerges.